As video games entered the 16-bit era of gaming, everything was exciting. As a kid, this foray into new experiences, new graphics, sound, everything, it really was something to behold, and it made the early 90s a wonderful time to be a kid playing video games. Nintendo made noise when it unleashed its next-generation console, the Super Nintendo. And as super as the system continues to be to this day, super also proved to be more than just an adjective. It was the basis of most of their early marketing campaigns. Most games released early on for Nintendo's 16-bit console were christened with Super in the title, to further hammer home that point that the NES, this was not. And the first WWE wrestling game on the console was no different. Released in March of 1992, Super Wrestlemania was developed by Sculptured Software and was once again published by LJN, continuing a partnership from the NES days. Super Wrestlemania was the first of 3 releases by LJN for the Super Nintendo, creating a formula that would be implemented and improved upon over the years. Like any game that makes the leap from the 8 to 16-bit generation, obviously graphics are going to see a definite upgrade, and that holds true for Super Wrestlemania. The leap to the next generation allowed for real photos to be digitized and used within the game to accurately depict a superstar's likeness. And Super Wrestlemania was full of a cast of characters that had graced WWE video games over the years. Everyone from Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man to the Legion of Doom, Hawk and Animal, the game employs a great roster from the era. It might even be the first time the Road Warriors were actually playable in a WWE game. However, while having a roster consisting of more than a handful of WWE Hall of Famers, the fact is that all wrestlers in the game do play exactly the same. While this was standard fare for almost all wrestling games to this point, it's unfortunate that with improved graphics, visuals, and sound, gameplay didn't receive more enhancement. Each superstar has a punch or kick attack, and upon entering a grapple, a button-mashing combo allows you to attack your opponent with a small variety of moves. Despite these limitations, the game was still a strong upgrade from years gone by, with the overall gameplay and presentation providing a nice introduction into the next generation of wrestling gaming. From a graphical standpoint, the wrestlers looked the best they'd ever had in terms of mimicking their real-life counterparts, even down to the announcing team Vince McMahon and Bobby the Brain Heenan. Visually, the game looks good. When it comes to sound, there's a mixture of good and bad elements depending on how picky you are. We'll start with the petty negatives, such as having no music during the matches. For some, that's not a bad thing, but in a time when video games employed amazing soundtracks, especially during action games, it's a little disappointing not to hear anything during the bouts. That said, even with simple crowd effects in the background, it's not all that bad. At least the crowd reacts to moves being executed in the ring and has a really good fade in and out effect that really doesn't overstay its welcome. It actually flows pretty well. Another nitpicky comment is the constant grunting with every punch and kick that gets thrown. The sound effects in the game are good, everything from a genuine mat bump to the subtle effects of running off the ropes, but that grunting, I suppose you could say it adds to the game's charm, but it can be annoying if you're an audiophile who pays really close attention to details like that. Other than that, I can't rag too much on the sound though. The music in the game is pretty good too. Everything from the wrestlers' themes to the background music, it's on full display with the Super Nintendo's enhanced stereo 16-bit audio sound package. Super Wrestlemania boasts a couple of different match types as well, allowing players to compete in one-on-one matches, tag team matches, and the return of Survivor Series elimination matches, where 4-on-4 action takes place in a WWE game for the first time. These matches were always fun, and they acted similar to tag matches, but you're able to scroll through all 3 tag team partners before making the tag by pressing select on the gamepad. Once a wrestler is pinned, the animation will actually see that defeated wrestler walk back to the dressing room before the match resumes. It was a pretty awesome feature at the time, and was one that made the gameplay feel unique and fresh despite being the same as everything else. While Super WrestleMania was the WWE's first foray onto Nintendo's next generation of home consoles, it wasn't an exclusive home. The Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive, was also home to its own release of Super WrestleMania, and while the gameplay was the same, there were a couple of big differences. Let's start with the roster. Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and Ted DiBiase were present on both the Super Nintendo and Genesis ports of the game, but the rest of the rosters were completely different. While the Super NES was comprised of a roster that also included Jake Roberts, The Undertaker, Sid Justice, the Legion of Doom, and the Natural Disasters, the Genesis version dropped all of those superstars in favor of the Ultimate Warrior, Papa Shango, Irwin R. Shyster, the British Bulldog, and Shawn Michaels. It's a smaller roster than the Super Nintendo, but unique nonetheless. The other major difference between the two ports was that the Genesis version featured signature moves for each wrestler that could be performed at any time during the match. For a game whose characters all function the same outside of an aesthetic difference, specifically on the Super Nintendo, this discrepancy on the Genesis was quite significant. And finally, the Genesis version also contains a WWF Championship mode, where the player selects a wrestler, then must defeat the rest of the roster in a series of one-on-one matches to become WWF Champion. This was standard for a lot of WWE games preceding Super WrestleMania, but for some reason or another only ended up on one port of the game. Those differences aside, the Genesis game is pretty much the same as the Super Nintendo, aside from some sound capabilities that were specific to each system. Have a listen and hear the differences between the two consoles. Super WrestleMania on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis was the WWE's big jump into the 16-bit era of video games. It was a definite upgrade from the games before it, which was to be expected with a leap in console generation. But what made Super WrestleMania good is that it laid the foundation for the future of WWE games on both systems, which would see subtle but significant improvements in the years to come.